Finally, a house with some refined taste, Jessica cooed, gesturing expansively around the marble foyer as she guided guests through what she clearly believed was her marital home. She was dressed impeccably, designer everything, the kind of polished aesthetic that comes from having recently married someone with money and deciding that this was the personality trait she'd been missing her entire life. My ex-husband, David, stood beside her with the kind of smile men wear when they're watching their new wife perform, neither fully endorsing the performance nor quite willing to interrupt it. I'd been invited to the party, awkwardly, by my former mother-in-law, who maintained a complicated loyalty to both her son and her ex-daughter-in-law, and I was standing in the corner of the living room watching Jessica describe the provenance of each piece of art, taking credit for decorating choices I'd made 8 years ago, praising the sophisticated color palette I'd spent 3 months perfecting. Yet the twist came not from the irony of Jessica taking credit for my aesthetic vision, which was bittersweet but predictable, but from the fact that Jessica was standing in a house that was still, legally and financially, entirely mine. A fact that David apparently hadn't bothered to explain to his new wife, which meant I was standing there knowing something nobody else in the room knew, which meant I was holding leverage nobody else even understood they were about to give me. What would happen when the realtor's call came to confirm that the house I'd held onto was worth even more than we'd anticipated? My name is Victoria Ashford, and I have spent the last 3 years learning that the most valuable thing you can hold during a divorce is your silence about what you actually know. The house was purchased in 2005, before I married David. I'd bought it with money I'd inherited from my grandmother, $380,000 that I'd carefully used as a down payment on a $520,000 property in suburban Boston. I'd paid the mortgage, maintained the property, and by the time David and I married in 2008, the house was technically half his through the marital property laws of Massachusetts. But it was always understood, contractually, emotionally, legally, that the house was where I'd started, and it was the foundation everything else was built on. When David and I divorced in 2022 after 14 years of marriage, the house was the major asset in the settlement negotiation. At that point, the property was worth approximately $1.8 million. I had paid off the original mortgage in 2015. The house was, in practical terms, a pure asset. David wanted half the value, $900,000. My lawyer, Patricia Greenwald, had suggested a different approach. "What if you keep the house?" she'd said. "You could buy out his share by giving him $900,000 from your other assets, and you keep the property. Or you could do a delayed buyout. You pay him $450,000 now, and the rest over the next 5 years. But what you shouldn't do is sell the house and split the proceeds. You should own it outright." "Why?" I'd asked. "Wouldn't it be cleaner to just split the money?" "Because," Patricia had said, "the house is going to appreciate significantly. The neighborhood is gentrifying. The market is moving toward these older properties. And because selling a house you have an emotional connection to, that's a mistake people make during divorce. They want to be free of the situation, so they make financial decisions that aren't optimal. Don't do that." I'd taken her advice. I'd negotiated with David, offered him $900,000 from my investment portfolio, and retained full ownership of the house. He'd been relieved. He wanted cash, not property complications. He'd agreed quickly. The divorce was finalized in November 2022. By December, he was dating Jessica. Jessica was the kind of woman who needed to announce her success to validate it. She was a pharmaceutical sales representative who'd never owned property, but who clearly believed that marrying David meant she now had taste, sophistication, and a historical understanding of architecture. She rearranged my furniture the first month she moved in. David had let me take what I wanted from the house, and what remained was a collection of pieces that told the history of our marriage. Jessica replaced them with things from high-end furniture stores, things that looked expensive, but were actually mass-produced replicas of luxury goods. I knew all of this because David still invited me to family functions, and my former mother-in-law, Patricia Ashford, yes, same name as my divorce lawyer, which had created some amusing moments, maintained her connection to me despite the divorce. She'd ask me to come to dinners. She'd ask my opinion on things. She treated me as though the divorce had ended my marriage to David, but not my relationship with his family. So I'd been at the house multiple times over the past 18 months, watching Jessica slowly erase me from the space I'd created. The party was a birthday celebration for David's father, Gerald. It was scheduled for a Saturday in June, held at the house, at my house technically, and it would feature about 60 of David's family members and close friends. Jessica had hired a caterer and a decorator, and had spent an enormous amount of money making sure everyone understood that she was now the woman who owned this property. Except she wasn't. I arrived at 6:47 p.m. on the Saturday of the party, fashionably late, deliberately understated in my appearance. I wore a simple black dress and minimal jewelry. I wanted to be present but not prominent. Jessica spotted me immediately, and her face cycled through several emotions. Recognition, territorial assessment, something that looked almost like guilt. "Victoria," she said, and she moved toward me with the kind of false warmth that people use when they're trying to convince themselves they're not actually enemies. "I didn't know you'd be coming." "Patricia invited me," I said, referring to my mother-in-law. "I hope that's all right." "Of course," Jessica said, in a way that suggested it was absolutely not all right, but she was going to perform acceptance anyway. "Would you like a tour? I've made some changes." I said yes, and I followed her through the house as she narrated her decorating vision, taking credit for decisions I'd made, criticizing my previous choices, explaining how she'd finally brought some sophistication to the space. The dining room, which I'd painted a sophisticated taupe and accented with crown molding, was now a garish gold. "I felt the previous color was too boring," Jessica explained. "Gold is so much more elegant, don't you think?" The master bedroom, which I'd designed with cream walls and a subtle damask pattern, was now covered in what could only be described as ostentatious floral wallpaper. "The previous owner," Jessica said, and I actually flinched at that, the casual erasure of 14 years of my presence, had very basic taste. My art collection, which I'd curated over 20 years and had left because the divorce settlement specified that I could take personal items, but the art was technically part of the house's value, was now being attributed to Jessica's excellent eye for contemporary work. I stood there and I smiled. I made small comments about how different everything looked. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply observed and said nothing. And I understood, with absolute clarity, that Jessica had no idea that this house was mine. That David had not informed his new wife that the property she was taking credit for owning was legally and financially entirely his ex-wife's investment. That she was standing in a space that didn't belong to her, bragging about aesthetic choices she hadn't made, performing ownership of something that was actually a liability she didn't understand. Patricia Ashford found me in the kitchen around 9 p.m., after Jessica had finished her tour and moved on to other guests. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice soft with genuine concern. "I'm fine," I said. "Jessica is enthusiastic about her new role." "She's ridiculous," Patricia said bluntly. "David is making a mistake, by the way. I don't think he understands how much trouble he's in." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a suspicion I already knew. "The house," Patricia said. "He keeps telling me he owns it, that it's part of his property now. He's told Jessica it's their house. But it's not, is it?" "No," I said quietly. "It's not. Jessica showed me the deed the other day," Patricia continued. "She wanted to explain the home equity situation. The deed is in your name, Victoria. Entirely in your name. She doesn't realize it. David apparently hasn't told her. And when she finds out, I don't want to talk about it," I said gently. "Let me handle it." But I was already thinking about the conversation I'd need to have with Patricia Greenwald. The realtor's call came on a Tuesday morning, about a week after the party. "I have some excellent news," he said. His name was Marcus, and he'd been handling my property portfolio for the last 5 years. "That property in Boston, the one in the historic neighborhood, a developer has approached me about acquiring it for a significant premium. They want to develop the land and the surrounding properties into a mixed-use development. They're offering $2.8 million for your house alone." I sat down. "That's substantially above market value," Marcus continued. "The market value is approximately $2.1 million right now. They're offering a 30% premium because your property is key to their development. But they need an answer quickly. They need it within 2 weeks. I'd been keeping the house more as an investment than anything else. I could have sold it years ago, but I'd kept it because it was mine, because it represented the foundation I'd built before David, because there was something satisfying about maintaining ownership of something that beautiful. Now I had to decide what to do with the fact that Jessica had been bragging about her refined taste in a house she didn't own, a house that was potentially worth nearly $3 million, a house that was entirely my asset. I called David directly. "We need to talk," I said, and I could hear the tension come into his voice immediately. About what? He asked carefully. About the house, I said. And about what you may or may not have told Jessica about who owns it. Victoria, I don't think. I'm not angry, I said. I'm not trying to create problems. But I've been made an offer on the house. A significant offer. $2.8 million. And before I make any decision, I need to make sure you understand what that number means for your situation. I heard him process this. $2.8 million, he said quietly. For the house. For my house, I said. Which is still mine. Which was part of our divorce settlement because I bought out your share with $900,000 from my investment portfolio. Which you apparently never explained to Jessica. Oh God, David said, and there was genuine distress in his voice. I'm not trying to punish you, I said. But I wanted to make sure you understood the situation before Jessica finds out that the house she's been bragging about owning is actually my asset. That's going to be a conversation you need to have. What are you going to do? David asked. Are you going to sell? I don't know yet, I said. But I wanted you to understand the situation first. As a courtesy, I didn't accept the developer's offer. Not right away. What I did was hire Patricia Greenwald to prepare the documentation I would need if Jessica and David tried to claim any interest in the property. I had my attorney send formal notification to David clarifying the ownership structure, the mortgage-free status of the property, and the fact that it had been purchased entirely with my premarital assets and maintained throughout the marriage with my funds. It was a legal formality, but it was also a statement. I know what I own, and I'm not going to let anyone misrepresent it. Jessica found out about the house situation 3 weeks later. I don't know exactly how, whether David finally told her, or whether she discovered the deed on her own. But suddenly, her social media presence changed. The photos of the house disappeared. The posts about finally having refined taste were deleted. The Instagram stories bragging about her sophisticated home were gone. David called me a few weeks after that. I'm sorry, he said, for how this all unfolded. For Jessica, for the situation, for all of it. I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it. I just wanted to make sure you understood what you were walking into. And I wanted to make sure you knew that I wasn't going to be silent about what actually belongs to me. I eventually sold the house 6 months later to the developer. I received $2.8 million. After paying my realtor's commission and my attorney's fees, I netted approximately $2.6 million. It was substantially more than the $1.8 million the house had been valued at during the divorce. It was a reminder that Patricia Greenwald had been right. The house would appreciate, and holding on to it was the correct financial decision. More importantly, it was a reminder about the power of silence. When Jessica bragged about that house at the party, when she took credit for my aesthetic choices, when she performed ownership of a property that wasn't hers, I could have corrected her immediately. I could have humiliated her in front of all those guests. I could have made it clear that she was standing in a house that belonged to me. Instead, I'd stayed silent. And that silence gave me time to understand the full picture of what was happening. It gave me time to consult with my attorney. It gave me time to realize that the best response wasn't confrontation, but documentation. By the time the truth came out, it wasn't a personal attack. It was just a legal fact that had to be acknowledged. David and Jessica divorced 2 years after the party. Apparently, the discovery that Jessica didn't actually own the house, that it had never been hers, that David had apparently been unclear about the property situation, created a significant rift. She'd felt deceived. She'd felt like the house was something she'd been promised that wasn't actually real. I felt sympathy for her, actually. I understood the experience of believing you'd married into stability and security, only to discover that the situation was more complicated than you'd thought. But I also understood that the information had been there to discover. She'd just chosen not to look for it because she was too busy performing ownership to examine whether the ownership was actually real. David tried to reach out to me after the second divorce to suggest we might try again. I declined gently. Some doors, once closed, are better left that way. I kept the $2.6 million invested. I bought other properties, a beautiful condo in Boston's Back Bay, a rental property in Brooklyn, a vacation home in Vermont. I built a portfolio that was entirely mine, that didn't depend on anyone else's decisions or anyone else's financial security. And I never forgot the lesson that the party taught me, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing. That sometimes the best response to someone's performance is to simply observe it, document it, and wait for reality to catch up. Jessica had bragged about having refined taste while standing in a house that wasn't hers. I'd stood there and let her. And eventually, that silence cost her everything she thought she'd gained. Not because I punished her, but because she'd built her entire sense of security on a foundation that was never actually solid. The refined taste, it turned out, belonged to someone else entirely.